Well, it's over, isn't it? I mean, Christmas Eve was Tuesday, Christmas Day was Wednesday, and I drove down the street on Thursday and people were already taking down decorations in their yard. Done with one thing and on to the next. I mean, HEB didn't take too long, right? The Christmas aisle quickly transformed into a combination of New Year's with the first hints of Valentine's Day. Christmas Day is past, so let me ask you this. Was it what you expected? Was it what you thought? Was it what you had prepared for? I mean, some of us have had decorations up and playing Christmas carols since our fall decorations came down at the end of October. Don't raise your hand, we know who you are. Here in the church for 4 weeks, we have prepared our hearts and our homes for the coming of a baby in a manger. I mean, we read scriptures from the prophets. We lit the Advent candle. We sang songs like O Come, Emmanuel, along with other traditional carols. We decorated the church. We bought poinsettias. At your house, you might have set up decorations and bought and wrapped presents. You decorated your tree. You took photos with Santa. You sent Christmas cards. You attended parties and you bought gifts for loved ones. We spent so much time in anticipation of Christmas, in preparation for Christmas, getting ready for Christmas. And then just a few days ago, many of us gathered here in this room and we heard the Christmas story and we sang Silent Night and we held candles high. And then there was, for some of us at least, the joy and chaos that was Christmas Day. Kids, presents, probably way too much food, playing with toys, cleaning up wrapping paper. Some of us had one Christmas celebration with family, and then some of you traveled house to house, one side of the family to the other to ring in Christmas with your loved ones. But after all the hype and preparation and gift choosing and gift giving and gift opening and decorations and celebrations, it's over. It's all done, right? I mean, the bags are thrown away. The food is cleaned up and put away, or just a hint, probably should be thrown away by now. The presents have been played with, and some of them have already been put in a closet or forgotten about. And soon we will come in here and we will take down the Christmas tree and pack up the ornaments. And you may do the same thing at your house, although there are probably some of you who will just take down the Christmas ornaments and put up enough Valentine stuff to keep your tree up as long as possible. Again, don't point at anybody. And I don't know about you, but there's really nothing as stark as your house post-Christmas decorations, is there? I mean, you know, when everything's packed away and you look on your walls, and even though you've put those same photos up that you had in November or October, your house still seems a little more empty. Now, if Christmas was only about decorations, it would be over, right? If it was only about presents and cards and food, then we're done. If it was only about lights and trees and singing Silent Night with candles, then we're finished. And sometimes I think we sometimes view Christmas as a destination to arrive to, and we make it seem as if it's the goal of the end of a long journey. And there's some truth to that, right? The prep work we do, the push that we do, and then how many of you took a good Christmas Day or day after Christmas nap? Like you prepare and get ready, you load up the car, you check your map and go, and at some point you arrive, and then you're no longer driving anymore. And if you went to visit family this year, there was a point where you arrived and the trip was over. If you hosted Christmas festivities at your house, then you cleaned and prepared and cooked and welcomed and ate and opened presents, but then it was over. But Christmas isn't a destination to be arrived at. And Christmas is not the end of a process. At least for me, Christmas is a reminder of a continual journey. And our scripture today kind of reminds us of what it means to seek Jesus, to seek after Jesus. Not that we find him and say, okay, we're done. But what it means to continually seek after and follow Jesus. Because our scripture today is the story of the wise men. This account is not mentioned in Luke. We talked on Christmas Eve how Luke gives the most detailed account of Jesus' birth, and even at that fact, it's not very long, but it's not found in any other Gospels. But Matthew continues the story of the account of the wise men, and it's a story unique only to Matthew. And contrary to nativity scenes and children's Christmas pageants everywhere, there are a few things that kind of get thrown into the story that may not be exactly correct. Things we have learned more from a song than we have learned from Scripture. So first of all, when they visited Jesus, when the wise men visited Jesus, he was probably a little less than 2 years old. The wise men weren't at the manger. They probably weren't there with the shepherds and the angels. And we know this because of Herod's actions immediately following the visit of the Magi, and I will let you read that. Second, the only indication of the number of kings that we have is from the hymn, not Scripture. There's nothing that says that there were only 3. We get that probably from the gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And third, there was nothing that really says they were kings. They were wise men who watched the stars and noticed that the sky was different. So why tell the story? Why tell us about these wise men from the east who came to find Jesus? I think there's a few things that we can gather. And as the story of the wise men reminds us of I'm going to point out 3 main things today. First, the story of the wise men reminds us that we should always seek him with our wisdom. The wise men came from the east following the star. The star led them to the place where Jesus could be found. But they came because they had been looking for the signs. They didn't maybe know when or where, but they knew what to look for. And by paying attention, they were able to recognize that the child had been born, and that could possibly mean that the King of Jews had come, and they had come to worship the King of the Jews. They were ready. And once they saw what they needed, they were off, following the star that led them to the child. Now imagine if they had not been looking at the skies. If they knew what to look for, right? But they were like, we'll look up. Every once in a while, we'll look up and check. Imagine what would happen if they had not been studying. If they had spent their days focused on everyday affairs, worried about everyday things. If their eyes were distracted, then they wouldn't have been directed to see. And if they didn't know what to look for and then weren't looking for it, they would have missed it. So my first question is this. Our first reminder is this. Are we still looking for Jesus? I mean, it was the focus of Advent, right? It was the first and foremost in our minds, and we had a countdown and Advent candles, and maybe you had an Advent calendar at your home, or maybe your desk or your wall had one of those little countdowns with the blocks that you turned in and out to count down the days. And if you were like me, you counted 25, and then you didn't count again until you need to go change it now. But after Christmas, there's not really that reminder. It's easy to just veg out and close our eyes and take a nap and let down our guard. But friends, Christmas isn't the end. It's a reminder and it's a beginning. And the question is, are you still looking for Jesus? Because God doesn't just show up one day of the year on Christmas Day, but in our everyday lives, at work, at school, at home, when we are missionaries in other countries. How are we looking for God working in our lives? How are we trying to see where God is moving? Because it's so easy to go through our day and just let our day happen to us instead of being aware and looking and seeking. But what's hard is to constantly be looking for what God is working. Opening our eyes to see that we can find so many ways where God is at work in our everyday life. Quietly bringing about relationships, healing sicknesses, relieving suffering, presenting opportunities to make His name known. And we can be a part of that work if we are ready and willing and looking for the signs that indicate where Jesus is and where we can join Him. First, we seek Him with our wisdom. The second thing that this story of the wise men reminds me of is that we honor Him with our gifts. Now, the Magi had gifts, right? They were gifts meant for a king. They were gold and frankincense and myrrh. And you can do a deep dive into those meanings of those gifts, and I encourage you to do that. But these gifts would have been brought to royalty. They would have been used to honor someone, to show honor. And so Herod, the king, calls them in. And what do? Nothing. The gifts aren't for Herod, the gifts are for Jesus. But then they come before the baby and they honor him with gold and frankincense and myrrh. And they bow down and worship him. Herod didn't get any of that. Jesus did, and it makes me ask this question. Who am I giving my gifts to? We have so much to offer. We have talents and skills and finances and resources and time. And God has gifted you and blessed you and placed you where you are for a reason. But so often we are eager to give our gifts to less than royalty. We use our gifts for our own gain, or we let them go to waste. Often we lay our gifts at the feet of our own ambitions or the ambitions of the world instead of at the feet of Jesus. But the gifts that you have, the abilities you have, the money you have, the time you have, the resources you have were given by God so that you could use them to glorify God and further His kingdom. So that you, through your obedience and your love, be an example to the world and draw people to follow Jesus. And following only Jesus means that you are giving those gifts to Him and not to someone else. The wise men only have the gifts they have, and they have a choice. Give it to Herod, the earthly king, or give it to Jesus, the Messiah. We seek God with our wisdom, and we honor Him with our gifts. And the third thing that this reminded me of is that we worship Him through our obedience. We worship God through our obedience because we trust that He will do what He says He will do, even when it doesn't make sense. There's a Christmas time joke that says, what would have happened if it had been 3 wise women instead of 3 wise men? They would have asked for directions. They would have arrived on time, helped to deliver the baby, cleaned the stable, made a casserole, brought practical gifts. But here's the deal. God doesn't always work with practical, does He? In fact, God does the impractical all the time, at least in our minds, right? I mean, God doesn't always do things the way that I think He should do them. Whether it's something that doesn't make sense, like choosing fishermen and tax collectors to be your disciples, or eating with sinners and tax collectors, or telling people to turn the other cheek, or give to strangers, or consider others greater than themselves. Turning water into wine at a wedding, having your feet anointed with oil, wiped with hair, and washed with tears. Jesus doesn't always make sense. And what He asks of us doesn't always make sense to us either. But because we trust, we obey. We don't have God all figured out, and that's a good thing, because we have to trust that He knows what's best, even when it doesn't make sense to us. And He asks us to follow with everything we have, wherever He leads. And one way we can worship is by showing that He has our full trust. Did it make sense for wise men to travel over field and fountain and moor and mountain? They worshiped because they were obedient. They knew what they were to do, and so they didn't let anything get in their way. They weren't enamored with Herod's power or position, and they weren't distracted by his lies and deception. A star appeared in the sky, and they said, "Let's go." And I'm sure there were others who thought they were crazy. Just because a star is in the sky, you're going to leave everything and travel to find a child? But they knew, didn't they? Scripture says that they knew this, and they knew He was the King of the Jews, and they knew they had to go. And so they follow a star, not wavering from their path, until they found the King, the baby. And they offered the gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. What's a child going to do with gold and frankincense and myrrh? But I think their first gifts they offered were this: trust and obedience. Even when they thought it might not have made sense. Is God calling you to do something that doesn't make sense? Maybe that is to have a hard conversation with someone. It would be easier to stay quiet and assume they'll be the first one to talk, but God is saying, take the first step. Make the call. Send the text. Maybe that decision is with a job. Maybe applying for something new, which means leaving your comfort zone. Or maybe that's making a commitment to give to the church. As we have talked about, regular and sacrificial. And you think, God, that doesn't make sense. Or maybe it's signing up to join a ministry or to use your gifts as we've mentioned before. Or going on a mission trip. Our students who go to Army and sleep on the floor of a church and pay money to go and rebuild people's houses. Doesn't make sense. But know this, like the wise men, your first gifts may not be the gifts you bring, but the first gifts might be your obedience and your trust. And we can worship God with our obedience. Christmas is over. We have to wait another 320 days or so until it's time to break out the trees and crank up the carols. And in 11 months, we will once again pull out the decorations and begin Advent all over again. But remember, Christmas isn't the destination, but it can be a reminder. A reminder that we should seek Him with our wisdom, not get so distracted by the things of the world that we miss what God is doing and working on in front of us. To honor Him with our gifts, to bring Him our gifts, our talents, our abilities, and use those to glorify God and build up the kingdom. And to worship Him with our trust and our obedience. To know that God doesn't always make sense, but He is always faithful to do what He says He will do, and our call is to follow with all our heart. Yes, Christmas may be over, but we can always, in our hearts and in our minds, prepare Him room.